So Dr. Doug Kelley is, he's just a really smart guy. I mean, he teaches on communication, conflict, negotiation, relational communication, forgiveness, reconciliation, all that good stuff. He's really into marital communication and that sort of thing. So let's just welcome Dr. Doug Kelley this morning.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Nice to see you all. Glad to have you here. And it's always good to be back at Scottsdale Bible. We attended here for a number of years, lots and lots of years, like even when Scottsdale Bible was back on McDonald Drive. Were you guys around in those days? That was before you? Yeah. And it was very small, and then we're going to get married here. But at the time, the gym was like the only building that really existed, and my wife didn't want to walk down the aisle with basketball hoops on each side. So we got married in a different church, and so anyway, that was 36 years ago. So that all that happened. I am a professor at ASU. Let me just give you a little bit of a background on that. I kind of found my way into professorhood in weird ways. I really thought I was going to go into some type of ministry or something or other. I'd come to Christ through a group called Young Life, some of you might know of. When I was in high school and was very involved with them and thought I was going to do some stuff that way. But one thing led to another. I ended up getting my master's in counseling. I realized when I was getting my master's that I really liked what we were doing. I just hadn't really thought about the finer points of like sitting in an office all day, listening to people who have problems, and that's not kind of my vibe. I'm a little more upbeat than that. So what I do now is I teach about relationships, and then I refer people who are having trouble to my friends who are sitting in offices, listening to their stuff. So that seems to work out really well for me. If you want to, you can go online. I don't have any popular press books, but we have some academic stuff. In particular, we've been studying forgiveness and interpersonal relationships for 20 years. And we're doing some cool things with that right now, including working with boys and girls clubs and teaching children how to forgive. I've spoken in the Middle East, in the West Bank, in Jordan, about forgiveness, and interpersonal forgiveness, not necessarily with Israel, which is out of my realm of expertise. And so we've got some stuff out on that. And it's really important to me. My most recent book last fall is called Just Relationships, and it's about how to treat one another in a way that's just. It like takes social justice concepts and then says, what about one-on-one between us? Because we advocate for one another every day. You advocate for your partner, right? You create spaces for each other to become all that it sounds corny, right? Because the army grabbed it, but to become all you can be, right? In that sense, that that this is part of what we do. When you're a parent, you create spaces for your children to become who they are, right? I mean, that's what we do as parents. Like, there's nothing that makes you more happy. And it's interesting to me, like at the university, I really love teaching at ASU because I just love where college students are developmentally and what's going on with them. Like, for many of them, the idea of being in a relationship with someone where that relationship actually makes you better as a person is a new thought. It just never occurred to them that maybe somehow I'm better for being with you, or maybe you're better for being with me. Like that's absolutely new. So as we look at communication this morning, we are going to be thinking about things to some extent from that perspective. One thing that's on my mind this morning I'll just share with you, and about the importance of this stuff as you're thinking about it. I had a text from a friend yesterday who's in her late 40s saying that she and her husband are separated. They have 3 kids, college and high school age. And he, a couple of weeks ago, just went missing for 5 days. Just took off. And then he came back, but he said, but I can't live here, I'm a mess. And they've had a tremendous amount of stress. They've had kids that have some disabilities, and they have finances, but that comes with its own stress also, and the way some of that is worked out. And she is in the process of trying to figure out what that looks like. What's happened to them? How did they get to this place? How did she not know he was in that spot? So what we're talking about here is absolutely critical for your future. There's a longitudinal study out of Harvard that's been running for over 50 years. I can't remember how long it actually is. It might be like 70 or 80 years actually. It's had about 4 different directors as they've looked longitudinally. And the consistent finding on this is more than cholesterol levels or more than your history, family history for cancer and all that other stuff, is whether you are in healthy relationships in terms of your longevity, in terms of your own psychological well-being. That's it, right? And we know that to some extent, but we don't live that way oftentimes, right? The person that's sitting next to you here is the person that you may take most for granted in your life. That once you get in, like once you're married and you're doing this thing, job, financial concerns, oh my gosh, we're pregnant, but my 3rd grandchild's coming along, but it was a surprise. They were taking protection, doing everything they were supposed to be. They already had 2, they knew how this happened, right, you know? And one night my son, they're in their 30s, and his wife was missing. He went walking around and found her sitting on the floor in the bathroom in tears. And he said, what's up? What's going on? She shows him the test. You're getting fixed, you know. Yeah, where this is not happening again. And it's crazy, right? Because all of these other things feel more urgent and more important, right? And so they crowd in on the real business of living. Not that those things aren't important, but the real business of living, which is really taking care of one another and staying close to one another. So we're going to unpack some of that this morning. In my hour time, we can only do so much, but I'm going to try to give you some key things that I think are, some of them are skill related, but most of them are the underlying foundation that makes skills work. Some of the things we're talking about today, like, let me just back up and come at this from a different perspective. Like, from a counseling perspective, a couple will come in and talk to a counselor, and the counselor might say, I could recommend you do these things in terms of communication or clarifying. We've tried that. We've read 4 books, or maybe the wife's read 4 books and got her husband to read parts of a couple of books, on relationships. And we've tried, and we're working at those things, but they don't seem to work, or we can't seem to be able to do them. Something's wrong. We find ourselves fighting over little stuff all the time, and I think maybe I married the wrong person. Right? It just doesn't fit. I don't know what we were thinking. Right? And so for a lot of approaches to handling relationships, because they don't deal with the foundation elements, are very short-lived in terms of how effective they are. So what I'm going to give you today, I think, is critical to laying that foundation. If you get a hold of that, then you can fill in with all kinds of other stuff. There's lots of good stuff that's out there. Okay, so on your sheet, I will go through probably most of the front part of it, at least. I never get to the back part, but it's always there as a reference to you. The first thing is, and by the way, if you have questions or anything along the way, please stop me and ask. I'd love to deal with where you're at, or what fits or what doesn't fit with you in your experience. Attend to the relationship message when speaking and listening. And I have in quotes, we fight about the little things. So in every communication message, there's at least 2 levels of meaning. And the 2 that I'm concerned about are the relationship level of meaning and the content level of meaning. So the content is typically understood as the verbal topic. right? So what are we actually talking about? We're talking about dry cleaning. We're talking about getting the oil changed on the car. We're talking about trash. We're talking about whatever it is. That's the topic. That's the content. And what a lot of couples find is that they spend a lot of time talking about things that seem inconsequential. Right? So if little things that shouldn't be that important keep coming up, or if those little things that shouldn't be that important have way too much emotion packed into them for the topic, then you know something else is going on, right? There's actually a relational message that's underlying that, and that's what we're really fighting about, right? So Anna is a tail light person on cars. Like, she just loves tail lights. So if we're driving down the road and she says something and she goes, "Oh my gosh, I love the taillights on that new Toyota up front," and I say, like, "Yeah, I do too. I think they look awesome. It's a Nissan." And she's like, no, it's a Toyota, I'm sure. Like, because I'm zoned into taillights, and I'm like, well, that's fine. I mean, you can think what you want to, but it's a Nissan. You can see where this is going, right? And the thing is, like, I could just speed up and we could go and look and see what kind of car it is, but at this point, this is transitioning from a discussion about taillights to a relational discussion. Like, what might be some of the relational issues that are starting to go on that are going to lead this into a conflict?
Why are you always correcting me?
Yeah, why are you correcting me all the time? You always think you're right. By the way, my wife and I have been in counseling 6 months after my book Marital Communication came out. So I just wrote something for another book we're doing, and I said something about life being ironic. My youngest son dropped out of high school in his junior year when I was teaching family communication. Later, he went back to school and he was sitting in that class while his mom and I were in counseling together. You know, it's like, seriously, right? You know, if you think there's a God and he doesn't have a sense of humor, you're just, you know, you're mistaken. You're like, what are the odds all this would go on? By the way, I share that with you, and I share it with my students at ASU also, because that's part of the journey for many of us. It's hard, man. Relationships are just really hard, and so it's good. Like, we've hung in there, we've fought and scratched, and to stay in, and our relationship in many ways is much closer than it was before. And our son who dropped out of high school, we have a fabulous relationship with. I'm thankful for that. Not because we followed a certain formula. I'm just very thankful that it worked out that way. So one of the things that, like, Anna and I talked about, that's how I got off on this thing when we were in counseling. She's like, well, you always think you're right. Like, well, I wouldn't hold an opinion if I didn't think it was the right one. So yes, I mean, if I didn't think it was right, I just wouldn't give you my opinion on it. I'd be like, I don't know. We have very different ways of approaching that. She has a way of approaching it that is like, well, I kind of surface some information and I kind of put it out there, but if you counter that, I might be like, well, it's all right. She's not really a fighter in terms of like arguing and debate. If you get a PhD, you're trained to make an argument, right? You're trained to be right, or to think you're right. And it takes a lot of untraining, even in the classroom, to come in and say, like, I don't really know, let's talk together. So that's been a huge one for us on that. What else might be going on in that simple little taillight conversation? Yeah?
No matter what, you may not realize it, but I'm going to win.
Okay, yeah, it becomes about winning and losing, doesn't it? And you just the very first marriage workshop.
I'll find a way.
Yeah, the very first marriage workshop I ever did. And we were living in Seattle, Washington at the time. I was teaching at Seattle Pacific University. And we did this little workshop, and Ann was there, which was a huge mistake because she now knew everything I was telling everybody else about marriage. And we were in some kind of argument or disagreement when we got back. And in the middle of it, she stopped me and she said, "You're doing to me just what you told those couples never to do." And I was like, yeah, I am. I am sorry. She goes, "Why would you do that?" I can still picture her face. It was so innocent. She's like, "Why would you do that?" And I'm like, well, because I wanted to win. That's why. I mean, I didn't think we were going to get divorced over this, you know. And so on the short run, I'm just feeling petty tonight. I just want to win. Right? It's like, if you haven't experienced that yet, you probably will. Maybe you're a better person than I am and you won't, but you probably will. It's like saying that you'll never sound like your parents to your children or something. At some point, you're just tired enough where I don't want to have a conversation with you. Just go to your room and stay there until I feel like coming up and talking to you. Right? It's not a great parenting strategy, but I just don't have the energy to be a better parent at the moment. So the relationship issues, like who's going to win? Who has the power and the control? Do you respect me? How close are we? It doesn't seem like you care. It's just like are we, why are we doing this still, right? Like when I hear you say these things, it sounds to me like I'm not very important to you. It's all of that is packed inside that. But normally we don't say that to one another. Right? And to be honest, sometimes you can't in that moment. To bring that issue up right at that moment wouldn't go well. We're going to talk about arousal levels in a few minutes and what happens to us when we get into those places. So one of the things that we need to do when we're in conversation is be aware of those relational messages. Right? Be aware of the relational messages. In my marriage, that in particular, that has meant being aware of my tone of voice. I come from a family where people sometimes are intense. That's the word we use for it. And so I tell you something, and then you're like, okay, I'm sorry, I didn't really catch everything you said. And we go, all right, look, oops, excuse me. Right here, look. Sorry about what I said. You see that? There it is. She's like, okay, I'm not going to talk to you. I'm like, what? I just pointed out, all I said was, and she goes, no. See, and you all know that's not all I said, right? Because you heard the tone. And so she grew up in a family where there was never any conflict. Her father never raised his voice. It was unhealthy that way, right? They needed to have some stuff. They needed to get into it every now and then. So they were unhealthy on the other spectrum. And so she hears that little bit of tone come out from me, and instead of fighting me, just shuts down. I won't deal with that. Right? Don't yell at me. I go, I am not yelling. Right? She goes, yeah, you are. I am not. If you want to hear yelling, I can show you yelling, but that's not. I'm intense. That's what I am. Right? And so we were all about intensity. So oftentimes it's the nonverbals, the facial expressions, what's happening in terms of how available you are physically to one another. Normally you'd stand closer to each other or come up and give each other a little kiss, and that's not happening. Ann and I kiss 3 times before we go to bed at night. It's just, we've done it our entire marriage, just kind of roll over and 3 little kisses, and then we go to sleep. California King, when we're ready for sleep, we don't want to see each other until, we want to actually sleep. So, so it's like, 3 kisses, see you in the morning, love you. And if somebody doesn't roll over, somebody just turns out the light, you're like, oh man, there's something going on. It's just a clear message. You can't just say, well, I forgot. No, you didn't. Not after 36 years of marriage, you forgot to kiss me 3 times? Okay. The second one, create a mindfully mindless marriage. So one communication scholar, by the way, I'm in the communication department. I'm like a social psychologist, but I study communication. One communication scholar said that virtually anything of importance in terms of communication that we study is probably 60 to 90% mindless. Now you hear a lot about mindfulness today, but not very much about mindlessness. So mindlessness is basically habitual behavior. So any type of complex behavior that you engage in has to become habitual at some point for you to be able to engage in it. I'll draw you just a quick diagram. This is a functional diagram, not a structural diagram, right? So don't tell somebody like, hey, this professor from ASU said the brain's structured like this. Go, no, I didn't. I'm just drawing it so you can kind of get an idea of how some of this works. So this is like a side version of the brain. It's a little ET-ish, but nonetheless. And so we're going to talk about arousal, but back here in the brainstem, this, by the way, is a little structural. Back in the brainstem, kind of that primitive part, some people talk about the reptilian part of your brain. But the fight and flight mechanism that you learned about in Psychology 101 is happening back here, right? Kicks in, you know, you're here at night, you hear something outside some door, your body goes on activation. And we're going to talk about that because it's critical to us being able to deal with conflict together. And then, let's see, we're going to put the subconscious here. We're not talking about the subconscious. Okay? The reason we're not talking about it is because the subconscious isn't really directly accessible for us for the most part. You can get to it maybe through therapy or maybe through hypnosis or some other things, or in your dreams that might come out. But you can't, like I can't ask you right now to turn to your partner and say, you know, to share a memory you repressed when you were a child. Just go back and get something that you're like, oh my gosh, I just had forgotten about that, right? You can't do that, right? So I'm not saying this isn't important, but I'm going to leave that to my psychology friends. In the front, this is a little accurate, or it's close to accurate in a way, although we're learning the brain's much more complex than this, is the conscious part of the brain, right? What you're aware that you're thinking of, right? What are you aware of? And this part only handles so much information at a time. Right? Like, I don't know if any of you remember, some of you might be old enough, but when we went to 3 zip codes in the Phoenix area, right, it used to all be 602 here. When it went to 3 zip codes, like, man, if it wasn't 602, I couldn't remember. Right? If you came and you told me that your, you know, phone number is 623-795-7677, okay, because 623 was not in my long-term memory yet. And so after 163 came into my long-term memory, I had shortcuts for remembering that part, and I could focus on just remembering the 7 units of information. 7 units is pretty good for most of us to remember. 10 is a little bit much. So there's only so much you can do here. And that means that we need our brains to operate in a mindless or habitual way for us to function. So if you're an athlete, or if you play piano or any kind of instrument or do any kind of performance, or if you walked into this room talking to somebody, you had to be functioning mindlessly for a major part of what you were doing, right? To use an athlete's example for a minute, like a lot of times with athletes, we talk about people being in the zone, or we'll even use the term that this person was unconscious, right? They're just like, because when they can't think about it, like when Paul Goldschmidt gets up to bat, he can't think about like, oh my gosh, I think my left foot's not, okay, it was looking even to you, right? You know, looking at the catcher, okay, elbow up, here we go, we're back, we're doing, you know, he can't think about that. If he thinks about it, he can't do it. It's too much. So you think about it in the batting cage, where you go and you work on one part. The rest of it's mindless, or sometimes we talk about muscle memory, right? But then it's through repetition over and over and over again. The goal is to get it to a place where you don't think about it. That means that you can focus on what's happening with the pitcher and the release point of the ball and what you think, what kind of pitch is coming to you. That's what you have to think about. But you can't be thinking about that ball and where your right leg is at the same time. So remember when you were kids and you did the rub your tummy, pat your head thing, right? I won't embarrass anybody by asking you all to do that. You can do that alone tonight or something and see how that works. It's hard because kids haven't made those actions mindless, right? Once you grow up and like, well, so I'm rubbing my head. So when I'm patting my head and rubbing my tummy, once you get older and you do this, because I started thinking about what I was doing with the mic, and then my hands started to go together because I was consciously thinking about the mic, right? And so I lost what was happening with both of them, right? Once you get older and those motions become mindless, then you can do them, right? Then you can get by. So if you're a pianist, if you're good in terms of typing or anything else, you know that you have to get to a place where you're not thinking about where your fingers go. When you walk, you have to not think about what's happening, right, unless there's a problem. Otherwise, you can't walk and talk. while I'm talking to you right now, I'm having to put adjectives in the right places, I'm using nouns, I'm drawing from some repertoire of like holding of common language and words that I use. It's a very complex process that mostly is out of our awareness. Right? Sometimes you say something so quickly in a conversation that you didn't even know you were going to say it, and then like you kind of meant it, but you really didn't mean, like, you know, that whole joke about like, was that my, did I say that out loud, right? You know, you're like, and they're like, yeah, you did, and you're like, that's really problematic, and I owe you a huge, apology. So why is this important for us? It means that to change our communication behavior, that we have to change habitual behavior, right? So it takes time and it takes intent. Simply reading a book on communication and then sitting down and deciding that you're going to change something won't work if it's anything that's highly emotional. Because once you become emotional about the topic, it will kick it right back here. Just like the fight and flight response will kick it here. You'll do what comes naturally. If you're working on a new tennis grip and you're playing in a match with somebody and you're losing, you will go to your old tennis grip to win, right? It will just go back there. The time to work on it is not during game day. So we'll come back to this mindlessness idea in a few minutes, especially when we talk about conflict. But the other important thing about it, I guess, on the positive end, is that we can create positive patterns that work for us, right? And that's the critical element. If you've been together as a couple for a while, then you've already started building patterns that you probably don't even know are there, right? And we know that the conflict in particular is extremely habitual. Couples who are struggling in their relationships, their communication is extremely predictable. And it's very entrenched, and it's difficult to get people to budge, in part because of this. They've built patterns, and then as soon as you say something and I hear your tone of voice, boom, I'm off and running. Right? So now it's not just my pattern, but it's what we've done together with each other. You've done this with your parents. You come home, your mom says something, and you hear that little tone, and man, you are back into I'm 16 mode with her, and you respond defensively, even though you're like, what am I doing? Because that's not who I am anymore. But there it is, right? It's just right there and comes right back. So we will we'll talk about that more fully in a few minutes. All right, with those two elements in place, I'm going to talk about some key skills, and then toward the end, we'll talk specifically about conflict, and I'll come back to how arousal and mindlessness work together when we're dealing with conflict. So on key skills, positivity is one. One of the things, pieces of research, I guess, that we're most confident of is that a ratio of about 5 to 1 positive to negative is associated with happy marriages. Now, that doesn't mean that you can keep a clicker in your pocket and all morning long, if you're doing well, yeah, so you're like, man, I'm counting. I'm like, I have 25 good things without blowing it yet, right? And so, then you say something and she looks at you like, you can't talk to me like that. You go, no, wait a minute, because you know what? I'm at like 25 to 1 right now. Dr. Kelley said 5 to 1. Like I've got like 4 more things I could just lay on you right now, and we're still good, right? So you can't play it that way. But here's the thing that's really interesting about this research. That they've found that different kinds of couples, different ways of interacting, they can all be happy with each other as long as they have around this 5 to 1 ratio. And it turns out, nobody's thinking of it that consciously, but it turns out that that's how they're functioning. So there are avoidant couples, like they just don't talk to each other that much. They're both really independent, and they don't deal with conflict very much, and they just kind of get through. It's not like the ideal we would set up if they do it. But if they have around a 5 to 1 positive to negative ratio, they're pretty happy. Right? It just might be that neither of us are talkers. We don't like working through everything. That's kind of who we are. And as long as we're positive enough and we stay in that space, it really works. And then there are couples that have been called volatile, not violent, but they're just more volatile, like everything. Like Like somebody picks up mac and cheese, it's on sale and it's not Kraft or whatever, or Annie's, you know, organic or something like that. And we're into it in the aisle, right? Because we care. Well, what are you doing? Like, oh, we don't have the money to buy organic, you know, and like, well, I don't care. I'm not putting that stuff in my body. Who knows what's really in it? And right, we just kind of get into it. We care a lot about everything. There was a couple who did a lot of marriage ministry here for a number of years, and they were like so awesome. They were good friends of ours. And they were just disagreed on so much. They were kind of volatile, you know, in some ways. They're really great people. But they had a great marriage because overall, really affirm each other. Even though they get into it and just willing to say it, like, hey, that's a problem for me. They do that, but they also just really affirmed each other along the way, and it worked. It still works, and they're still married. And then there are integrative couples kind of in this middle that are the couples that tend to talk more and they deal with conflict when they need to and all that kind of stuff. And they need to maintain about a 5-to-1 also. But so there are different ways of doing this marriage thing. It doesn't all have to look the same, right? You have to figure that out. But what is key is that we do need more affirmation than we need on the negative. One of the things we know for sure is that once you start to not do very well, you know, you're a little unhappy in the relationship, or that emotional connection between the two of you, which we'll talk about in a minute, starts to dissolve a little bit, then that one negative thing looks huge, right? That's why it's a 5-to-1 deal, because the negative stuff carries so much more weight. You're like, I did all this great stuff for you. Yeah, you did. But I'm telling you, that thing there, that hurt. I'm not saying all the other stuff didn't matter. I'm just saying I can't get there. I can't get past the hurt from this one to see all that very well. Right? So we have to be extremely careful with that. That's one of the reasons I study forgiveness, and I'll come back to talk about forgiveness in a few weeks. Receptiveness, listening. I'll just mention this one briefly, but there's nothing you can do for another person that is simpler, not necessarily easy, but simpler than listening. It is a gift. It is a way of being generous to another person, to listen to them, to what's important to them. I give my students a mindful listening assignment where they're supposed to go in and be really present with somebody, turn off your phone or turn it upside down or something or other where you can't see it, be focused, and listen with a non-judgmental attitude, not prepping what you're going to say in response. I give them this thing to do over the weekend. And this example came from about 1.5 years ago. And this guy who had taken a bunch of my classes, I get certain guys sometimes who just take all my classes because they can't figure the relationship thing out. And so they just keep showing up. But this poor guy, he'd lived with 3 different women, all 3 of them cheated on him. And he's just wounded, like so wounded, and just thinking he's never going to be in another relationship. And so anyway, on Tuesday, after they've done this mindful listening, I asked people like, hey, any thoughts about the exercise over the weekend and what went on? And they write some stuff up, they turn in. And his hand goes up, and I'm like, oh, okay. Like, anyone? You know, and he's like, all right, yeah, well, tell me what's going on, you know? And he's like, well, so I went home for the weekend, and I'm listening to my mom bitch about my dad like she normally does. And I'm thinking like, okay, where are we going? And am I going to need to intervene in this little, you know, story? And then he says, so I thought this might be a good time to try this mindful listening thing. And I'm like, okay, good. He said, and then as I'm listening to her talk about my dad, I realize, like, she's really hurting. Like, it's not easy to live with my dad. I wanted to hug him. Like, I just wanted to go like, dude, you get an A now. Like that's as much as I expected from you. Like, I was like, but just listening for a minute. All I'd heard is her bitching at my dad for years in the household. And he stops to listen to her and he realizes she's hurting. That's listening for us. That'll come to play too in just a minute when we get down to emotionally safe environments. Responsiveness. So not just listening, but responding in a way that the other person knows that we're there, that we're present with them, right? So looking at them, the nonverbals, the leaning toward them, sitting close if it's appropriate, or adjusting your chair so that they're the focus, making them the focus, right? It's a great gift to respond to someone else, right? When we're talking to people and they don't respond, hey, hello, right? Especially like once you're parents, if you're not parents yet, like, you'll have those moments, like, hey, talking to you, right? I need some response, right? I need something. But we need it as adults. Like, I need to know you're with me. I'm sharing something with you here. And if you're not with me, I don't want to waste my time with it.
Doug,
Yeah,
thinking
please.
about that when they have children, what's so important with children when you're talking to them is to get down at their level.
Absolutely.
In their eyes and really.
Oh, it's so good.
Yeah.
And we're so good, guilty of not being the listeners, with our kids, right? And we want them to listen to us, but then they come in to talk to us and we're still doing the dishes or working on this or that, and never take time to actually look at them and be with them in that moment. Yeah, it's so good. So some intimate communication. Genuine dialogue. We don't have time to go in detail on all of these, so I just want to mention this. Like, genuine dialogue means that I treat you like an equal, and I'm here to really hear what you have to say, but then I get to hear, you get to hear what I have to say. And by being with each other in a genuine, authentic way, there's something very moral about that, right? It's humanizing to be with someone like that. I was just listening to a story the other day where somebody was on a train in like New York City, and they'd gotten on, and the person, the conductor, or not the conductor, whoever it is, comes and checks your tickets and marks, whatever they do. And this woman had forgotten her purse, and she's already on the train. She thought, well, we'll just see if they check this round, and they did. And this guy came and he said, she said, I'm really sorry, but I just don't have it, and I didn't realize till I got on the train. That's just not normally what I do. And he said, okay, all right, well, I don't know, you look trustworthy, I believe in you. And she said, how are you doing? And he sat down with her and had this conversation. And he said, and then at the end of the conversation, he said, thank you for asking. Like, it's just nice to be recognized. It's just nice to be here, that someone knows I'm here, that it makes a difference that I'm here. And in our marriages, that it makes a difference that I'm in your life. Sometimes as our marriages get going, like, you can't tell anymore. Does it really make a difference I'm here, or could it be anybody? Just as long as the jobs of the relationship get taken care of, or of the household. Right? Make a difference. Genuine dialogue. Affection. The thing on affection, we all have different needs, affection levels of what we really need. Some of us are, like with love languages, if you know that stuff, some of us are very touch-oriented, some of us are word people, and the affection kind of comes through in different kinds of ways. It means different things to different people. But there's some research that's pretty interesting on this. Like it's fine to understand that we're different on certain things, on certain areas of our relationship. Like, Ann is a real detail-oriented person, and I'm a big picture person. And it drives each of us crazy at times, but it's okay. We're not going to leave each other for that. It's just irritating at times. And then as we've been married longer, we've really figured out how to use each other. Like, she's a phenomenal editor because she's so detail-oriented. So when I'm writing stuff, a lot of what I write goes through her. She's such a good editor, and she's so much more concrete than me. Like, it's great. That's why people are always asking, like, where's Ann to come to these things? And she's at something else this morning. Because there's that part that's so beautiful. But here's the thing with affection. People generally will find ways to find the affection they want if they're not getting it in their relationship. Now, it doesn't mean you have to give affection to your partner exactly like they want it all the time, right? But it does mean that if you have a partner that, like, touch is really important, then instead of choosing to sit in your two recliners to watch a movie at night, it might be nice to sit on the couch and snuggle together. Because you know for your partner that that's meaningful. Right? You don't want that person to be finding somebody who gives hugs at work to be their primary place of affection, right? And that's what happens a lot of times, right? Those kinds of elements. Like, we have basic needs. Of course, we're hardwired for it anyway. Like, babies need affection and touch. There's great research on all of that stuff. So talk about affection, what it means, what is affectionate to you, right? Sex is not always affectionate, right? So don't confuse the two of like, well, what do you mean? I haven't shown you any affection. We had sex twice last week, you know, and you're like, yeah, and we're not having it this week because I still have not experienced any affection from you. I need affection. Anne loves for me to hold her hand. She just loves that. We were walking last night, and I grabbed her hand. To be honest, it was sort of by accident because our hands bumped. And then once it bumped, I realized I should grab a hold of it. Like, oh my gosh, this is a good moment. And she was like, oh, thank you. It's so good. I'm like, score. This is so good. She loves that. When I walk, I'm a little ADD, so like when I walk, like I want to walk like this, like, you know, and you can't do that when you're holding someone's hand. So I can do for like 5 minutes, and then she can tell. She's like, do you want to let go of my hand? I'm like, yes! I just need to let go for a few minutes. I'll take it again in a minute. But those things are just huge for us. I'm talking about those elements. Love languages, I'm not going to spend time on. There's a great book on it. If you don't know about those, you'll hear it somewhere along the way, for sure. We don't have enough time. Emotionally safe environments, and then we'll go to conflict. So a few years ago, John Gottman was in Phoenix. John's done he was probably the premier marriage researcher for years and years. Maybe it's still considered that way by some. And he was doing a workshop on, used to be at University of Washington. And he was doing a workshop on emotional betrayal, which I thought was going to be about emotional affairs. Because you can have physical affairs, you've had sex with somebody, but you can have emotional affairs where you haven't done anything physically, but this person at work is the person you can really talk to and unload with, and it's not your spouse anymore, right? So, and there's some interesting research, by the way, on some gender differences. It's not always split exactly that way, but for women in particular, crushing, right? To know that, okay, maybe nothing's happened here, but you're telling her what? And you guys are what? No. But that's my spot. That is my place. And you've just given it to someone else, right? Just crushing at times. You have to really protect that area. But that's not what he was talking about. What he was talking about is this. He was talking about when we open ourselves emotionally to the core of who we are. Some people, there are a couple of psychologists a few years back that would draw circles like this and talk about different areas of our lives and then how deep we would go. And our emotions, in particular scary emotions for us, like fear, or sometimes even hope. Like sometimes we're afraid to even hope for certain things. Like I've always wanted to this, or I've always hoped for, but I can't even say it out loud, or it'll jinx it, or it's not going to happen, or it'll just, when we learn it early on, when you're a kid and you tell somebody you want to be an astronaut, and people are like, yes, you go ahead with that. Okay, Mr. Astronaut. Okay. So it's those things that are in here. And we let someone in, and it might be through something that we say, or it might be non-verbally that we make somebody aware of that. And then when they don't treat it well, when they don't treat that space where we've been vulnerable in a caring, responsive way, like we've been talking about, that is what Gottman was talking about of emotional betrayal. Oh, and I talk about crawling through emotional windows. That often those spaces, like for my wife, when she opens it, she just opens it a little bit. It's not like a door that's flung open. It's just a little bit. And then I kind of like come through like, can I come in here? And then I come in, and then I'm in that space with her. And Gottman tells a beautiful story. It's online, you can find it. But he was going to bed one night, finishing up a mystery novel, and he's really tired. He just wanted to go to sleep. He was headed in to go to the bathroom, and his wife's standing in there brushing her hair. She hasn't seen him yet. He just kind of comes and can see her, and he can see the wetness under her eyes. Something's going on. And he has the choice to make of either go back to bed and just finish his book, and I don't want to deal with this. He doesn't know if it's about him or something else, or to respond to her. So he chooses to go into the bathroom. They're in their mid-60s, by the way. I just love this picture. They're so good. They're probably late 60s or 70 now, but he goes in and he takes the brush out of her hand and he starts brushing her hair for her. And he says, "What's going on?" Just crawled through that emotional window, that space. You just open that up. After hearing that, him speak, I had two things happen to me where I didn't do as well as John did. He's had a lot more years practice than I've had, but Ann and I were hiking down the mountain, and I was talking away like I often do. I always have ideas about something that's going on, and she's a little more of an introvert. And she chose to share something with me, and when she did something, she said that there was something I thought was kind of appropriate for a little humorous comment, that not meaning I didn't care, you know what this is like I'm not saying I don't care about this, or you, it's just humor is all about timing, and you can't say, "Hey, remember that thing you said an hour ago? I thought this funny thing about it at the moment," right? That doesn't work, right? So I made this little comment, and then she just looked at me and she said, "That's it, I'm done." I was like, no, I really want to hear what you're saying. It just struck me as, she goes, "Yeah, that's it. I'm finished." She had opened to me, and I didn't take it. I didn't realize what was happening enough. Later that week, my son Daniel came home, and he had had a run-in with a friend who I knew really well, and he felt betrayed by him, and he came in, he was really hurting and just angry and saying stuff that I just knew was not true about this friend. Like, it was all extreme statements. So I let him rant about it for about 10 minutes. And then I said, after he kind of settled down a little bit, I said, "Do you think Josiah would really want to hurt you with whatever?" And Daniel looked at me and said, "That's what you always do. You always take the other side." And he went out the door and slammed the door shut and left. And I realized, again, that I had missed this emotional window. He had opened up to me to say, "I felt betrayed by a friend." And what did I do? Start checking the accuracy of the story. It just wasn't the point. And we could have talked later that night or tomorrow. We probably didn't even need to talk about it. He knew Josiah. They've been friends forever. They're going to work this out. And no business doing that. But I missed an opportunity to be with my son in a really significant way. And I had to apologize both to Ann and Daniel for those times. So responding, creating emotionally safe environments for one another. By the way, great video by Brene Brown, if you know that name. A lot of people are watching her stuff. TED Talk. Put in Brene Brown, vulnerability, TED, it'll come up, and she talks some about this, about how hard it is, and what she's finding in her research, to talk about it, health issues with each other, to talk about, to initiate sex with each other, where you're just afraid that once again they're going to be too tired or too whatever. Just hard places that require an emotional vulnerability. And one of the key things we do as couples for one another is create a safe emotional space for each other. Okay, now I've got a few minutes left, so I just want to talk about a couple of concepts real quickly on conflict, and then see if we have some questions. I'll hang out for a few minutes right afterwards. I have another commitment downtown, but I can hang out for a little bit. So let me just mention real quickly, all significant relationships have conflict. If you don't deal with it, and as I mentioned before, there are avoidant couples, and there are couples that are more volatile, and that's okay. We all have our different styles, but it's there, right? Stuff is there. That little changes are the key. Oftentimes couples become overwhelmed that they have to change everything about the way they do things. But you don't. You just have to start, because it begins to unravel. One small change here changes a response here, right? And it takes on. So it's critical that we don't get overwhelmed so that we have hope. Right? It's probably something in my counseling program that I didn't understand early enough as a young guy, of how people need hope to change. If you don't have hope, then you make destructive choices. Right? So you need hope. So there are different styles. We've talked about that. I'm not going to spend time there. I want to mention what's called runaway conflict there. Here's what happens. So we talked about the mindlessness before. And we know that mindlessness will get triggered by high arousal, right? That fight and flight mechanism. And so we go to what we know, essentially. So if you think about it, you're driving on the highway, and like a mouse is coming across, and he sees the car coming, and then he stops, right? He just freezes. He's just like looking at you, and you're like, dude, you have plenty of time, right? You're like, oh, move, and he just stops. Because for him, right, movement is how you get killed, right? When the wings of an owl or a hawk or something come over, if you move and run, they see you, and they come down and they get you, right? So they know instinctually the best thing to do is stop, don't move, right? But that doesn't work when a car's coming at you, right? So you go winging by and looking in your mirror to see if this little guy's still back there, and if you manage to straddle it both ways. So here's the thing, that it becomes critical for us to learn how to manage arousal. Otherwise, it kicks us into the mindless patterns. This kick into the mindless patterns does a couple of other things. It means that when we're highly aroused and we're operating out of mindlessness, it limits our ability to interpret incoming information. We just know this physiologically. When you're overly highly aroused, not moderate, moderate's okay, or even moderate high for some of us, but high arousal, I can't take in all the stimuli. The arousal focuses me. And then it becomes hyper-focused when I'm too aroused. To go back to the athletic example for a minute, like if you play sports, if you're too highly aroused, if you're too anxious, you don't see the field or the court fully. You miss stuff. You watch like a young quarterback, right, in the last 30 seconds of the game, throw the ball right to a middle linebacker who's standing there, doesn't have to move. And you're like, what's wrong with you? How could you not see that? All I saw was like, the running back, not the running back, but the receiver coming across, right, and had 2 steps on the guy that was guarding him. That's all I saw. And so high arousal limits our ability to interpret incoming information. I only hear what you're saying now as an attack. Right? And then high arousal limits our ability to respond because we go into mindfulness. Instead of responding creatively, now I go back to what I know, right? You trigger it and it's out before you even know it. The reason I call this runaway conflict is because it creates a spiraling effect, right? So you say something and I sense the defensiveness in your voice, and I respond back defensively, and you hear the defensiveness in mine, so yours escalates and mine escalates, and before you know it, we're off and running. And this is what couples report when they come into counseling. We're like, my gosh, we talk about all this stupid stuff, right? Tail lights, right? Like the beginning example. We had this huge fight the other night over that. I don't know what's wrong with us. We say, well, we can't talk about anything. Right? Because once you've learned this pattern, then the arousal triggers all the faster. Now I hear that little I know it all kind of attitude, tone of voice, or at least that's the way I interpret it. And so I'm becoming defensive and aroused, and you feel me closing off, and so you do, and then we either avoid each other or we attack each other, but we end up, running at this thing, and it takes off. We started the night wanting to have a great evening together. We started saying, like, you know what? Like I know some of our conflicts haven't been the best, but let's just be reasonable tonight and just work through this money thing. Like, yeah, that's good. We can do this. And then you sit down, and once that arousal starts shooting up, right, then man, it's almost all over unless you can reduce it. So let me just mention real quickly some ways to reduce arousal, and you can think about this on your own. It would be a great thing to talk about as couples. By the way, because of the mindlessness, to talk about how do we normally do conflict when we do it, right? Like, how does that normally go? What do we like about it? What is it that seems to be not as good, right? Where we move. Take responsibility for your own behavior in that, not pointing fingers. And then talk about, like, do you get highly aroused or not? One quick note on that, by the way. Some people think they're not highly aroused because they're not expressive emotionally, right? A lot of guys, some women. But if we hooked you up to monitors, you're like off the charts. A lot of men just shut down. And that's the way they handle high arousal. They don't like the feeling of it, and so they shut it down. And we know this from studies where people have been hooked up with monitors and such on that. And so simply because you don't express it as much as your partner might, doesn't mean that you're not highly aroused and some of this physiological effect isn't taking place. But so because arousal is physiological, it can help to do things that are physical to reduce it, which can be like deep breathing techniques to relax. It can be getting up and going outside and going for a walk. Don't have a financial conversation. If you're in a cramped apartment, don't sit in your cramped kitchen talking about your finances. Go to an outdoor patio restaurant and have tea and a croissant or something, like for $10. And keep your marriage alive with that, or go walk the golf course, or go walk whatever it is. Right, get out. The outside changes me. Right, for me, it just changes my perspective when I go outside. It's really good to be out. So do something physical. Take a break. Go for a run, and then come back and finish your conversation. But you have to agree to those things. You can't just walk away and say, "Hey, you know what? I'm going for a run." Well, now you have a new conflict to deal with, right? When you take off to work on that. So the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, I'm going to end with this. It's the next thing down on your conflict list. And then all the other strategies are a little more self-evident. You can read through those on your own. And this comes out of Gottman's work. It's a 4-stage process. And the stages aren't all clean. The first 2 in particular we all do. We probably all do all of these to some extent a little bit in some ways, or many of us do. Complaint and criticism. The difference here, a complaint is behavioral. When I say, like, you know what, like, we just last month paid $120 in overdraft bills because our debit card's out of control. We're not keeping track. We don't know what's happening with it. I don't go on. I have an app. I don't go on and check it. Do you? No, I don't even know I can't even find the app on my phone. You're like, okay, that's not working. We need a strategy to work. That's behavioral. What criticism is a personality attack, essentially. It's like a stable attack. My God, you were like a child. How hard is it? Take a receipt, put it in your pocket. We can't afford $100 a month on overdraft. Grow up. Wow. Okay, yeah. Wow. Okay, I'm like a child. Thank you very much. I'm out. Right, there you go. Right? So that's a difference, right? Now, all of us make some statements here and there, but this is, when this starts to characterize it, it moves to the second one, right, where there's a lot of defensiveness. When we feel attacked, we'll defend. Now, sometimes we avoid by going away, but sometimes we attack back. Oh, I'm such a child. Oh, can we talk? What about you? What about, like, let's go in and look at your shoes for a minute. Okay, and let's start counting. You want to talk? Yeah, you've been there. Okay, so right. So there's defensiveness. Some of that on these first 2, not the best, right? But we're not perfect, and we get through some of those 5-to-1, right? And keep the ratio going. Here's what happens: contempt. That sounds so negative, right? But here's what goes on. You know what contempt is? It's this, like, I'm above you kind of thing. You say something, and I'm like, oh, God, here we go. Here we go. Wow, all right. I'm checking out. because I'm thinking like, you're an idiot. Like, how could any human being think that way? I don't understand you. I just can't, right? But I probably, in contempt, I might express it. It's probably a lot nonverbal of what's going on. But what's really critical is this, that inside with contempt, I am emotionally distancing and pulling away from you. I am pulling back. A lot of people at this place go into fatalistic thinking. Oh my gosh, I am saddled with, we have 2 kids now. We go to Scottsdale Bible Church. God hates divorce. I'm stuck. This is going to be my plight, living with someone like you for the rest of my life. Right? Okay, sorry. I'll give you a donut hole afterwards and make up for this. Right, but it's what you can see the emotional distancing that goes on. One of the counselors that Ann and I had, she said, when you're not emotionally connected, everything is an issue. If you talk to friends, once you're married and you talk to friends who are getting divorced and you're like, what's going on? She goes, oh my gosh, John, like driving me crazy. And she goes through her list and you're thinking, your husband, Jake does all those things. You guys are okay. You're like, well, he does that. He leaves his shoes all around. He doesn't put everything away. Yeah, I forgot my birthday last year. We've been married 5 years, forgot my birthday. Hello, how did that happen? But I can handle it because we're still emotionally connected with each other. Right? That doesn't mean we don't need to talk about it, right? But it's different because we're connected emotionally. I can't emphasize enough how important it is to maintain that aspect of the relationship with each other. So what happens then with contempt is stonewalling is eventually an avoidance and really pulling away. It can be physical. My friend's husband, who just disappeared for 5 days, is an extreme situation, but it's pulling out. I'm done. A lot of men, because they don't like the high emotion and the arousal, when they start moving through this in an interaction, shut down because they don't like that. They don't like the feeling. They don't know what to do with it. I can handle conflict at work because I know how to do stuff. Like there are guidelines on how to do that. I don't know what to do with you. I don't know what to do with our teenage daughter. I absolutely don't understand a 13-year-old girl. I don't know. I'm lost. A lot of men feel very lost, like they don't have options in those spaces. That's not to excuse behavior. It's just to say that's why sometimes you'll see some gender differences come out. Okay, I'll stop there. I've got just a couple of minutes. Are there any questions or thoughts about what I've shared? I know it's a lot. But you see how this stuff is foundational? Like if you work on that emotional connection, if you work and figure out how do I keep arousal down. By the way, like Ann and I work together on that. Like, you know what? I feel like we're kind of getting heated, or at least I know I am. Let's like fix something to drink and go sit out by the pool to finish this conversation. Can we do that? You get some cheese. I'll open a bottle of wine or something. Nothing with too much caffeine. No high caffeinated energy drinks when you're conflict. But something where that changes the environment. It changes. Okay, take a few deep breaths and just relax for a second, and then I can say, okay, when you said such and such, like that sounded like this to me. And then she's like, no, that's not what I was talking about. I was talking about this. Oh, okay. Well, man, it's good that I got away from this long enough that I could, for a minute, calm down and then ask. Because I was gone in a different direction. Yeah.
I have a question.
What do you think?
When you're having a conversation and you as the listener kind of starting to go into that mode where you're like, oh, here we go.
Here we go, yeah.
What kind of things do you recommend to
Good question.
to us to kind of get yourself out of that?
Yeah, so the question is like when you're listening and then you catch yourself going into that place of like, oh my gosh, here we go. And so basically listening becomes endurance, right? Like I'm going to endure or tolerance. I'm not a big fan of tolerance. I'm more of a fan of dialogue. Sometimes by asking for clarification during that time, not at why questions can make people defensive. I don't like that term make, but people can oftentimes respond defensively to why questions because it sounds like I need to give a reason for something. that's different than saying like, can you help me understand this better? Like, can you give me an example from last week of when that happened, or an example? It could be them talking at work or talking about something in the relationship or whatever. So I like elaborating, clarifying, more information. Some people that I've worked with that struggle with the listening thing, like they struggle because the listening thing is just so passive. And if you have somebody who's really unloading, like that's fine for 5 or 10 minutes, and then you start to zone out even. You know, you're like, you know, here we're going, but I know I'm supposed to be a listener, so here I am. But I just can't do it anymore. Now we're 20 minutes down the road. So I'd like to recommend like staying engaged without turning the conversation onto yourself or without overly directing it.
Doug, one thing in our relationship that I found, Rose would have that comment like, we need to talk. And early in our marriage, I dreaded those words. And I found through time that I need to put on my big ears. In my mind, I gotta put on my big ears. I need to listen to what Rose has to say. And in time, I realized that those conversations were good, positive things for our marriage. And not something like, ooh, here we go.
Absolutely, yeah, like these have
I think
been
it was
good.
just changing my mindset that this is something that is on Rose's heart, this woman that I love, and I need to listen to her. And it was just a kind of a change in mindset.
Yeah, you know what's interesting about that? One of the counselors Ann and I saw, like I liked the counselors where we went in and we did left brain problem solving. We came out with ideas and concrete things and yada yada, like I can get into that. I mean, that's my job, that's what I do as a professor. We have a theory for what's going on, we address that theory, 3 possible solutions, implement during this next week, we're good to go, like I can handle that. And then we went into, like, with a counselor together where she was more interested in what was happening between us and the feelings going on, which I was happy to teach about. Left brain, right? Teaching about emotion is not doing them, I found out. So and I hated those sessions. I went, they were always good, but I hated them because I was not in control of them. I couldn't control that process. I didn't know where they were gonna go. And that scared me. So that was something that I had to change a mindset on, like you're talking about, of like, okay, I know that I don't know where this is gonna go and I'm not in control, but like, typically when we come out of these, it's been good. Now, sometimes really hard, you know, but I know this has been good for us. So that was a major issue for me also. Yeah, changing that perspective, yeah.
So one thing my wife and I have found is that we noticed that, you know, just by, I guess psychologically, men are more wired towards logic and women are more creatures of emotion.
To an extent, yeah.
To an extent, there's exceptions and all that, but we're pretty much classic logic and emotion. And we found that when she wants to unload something or she just wants me to actively listen, I innately want to be her hero. And so I want to solve her problem.
Absolutely.
So I go into problem solving mode and I start looking for solutions.
Yeah.
And then whenever I start presenting solutions, she starts to get frustrated with me.
Yeah.
And I don't understand why, because I'm like, do you not want to solve the problem that
Exactly.
you're talking about? Like,
If you
why are
have a
talking-
problem, then do this, and you don't have the
Why
problem.
do you not want to solve it?
Exactly. I love it, yeah.
She'll get frustrated
No,
and
it's so good.
up, and it took
Yeah.
years of this before finally she realized she was just like, I don't need you to fix everything.
Yes.
I just need you to hear it.
Yeah.
And as frustrating as that is for me just to kind of sit there
Yep.
and not problem solve,
Yep.
that was something we've really had to work through, and it's helped tremendously.
Yeah, nice. And that's part of that, sort of bringing the relational message up to the content part, right? Where, say, here's what I need from you. I'm gonna share with you what happened at work and what went on, and it really was kind of hurtful and emotional for me. What I don't need is for you to fix it. What I do need is for you to take me to dinner and listen to me, right? You know, and you're like, okay, good. And then on the flip side with Ann, because she began doing that with me also, I would ask her, is this something you want ideas about, or do you just want me to hear you? And she would be like, I don't want your ideas right now. I really just need to get this off my chest. And I'm like, that's cool, right? She knew where she was gonna go, what she wanted to do. She didn't need my ideas. And you're right, like I, as a guy, like I wanted to fix it, I wanted to be the hero, I wanted to come in on my white horse. But she needs that, she knew what to do, she just really needed somebody to support her. And then that's empowering her too. You know, when we were talking at the very beginning about being in relationships, helping each other become, if I'm always racing in to save you, then I'm short-circuiting your potential of becoming. There are times to jump in for each other, in both directions, right? For men and women, jumping in to help each other in that way. But there are lots of other times to just walk alongside and let that person grow, right? Just be with them and support them in that struggle. So, yeah, appreciate that. Cool. Well, lunch is here. So,
Yes.
Roger, you're going to get us set into that? And,
Yeah,
and then
okay.
I'll hang out for a few minutes, and then I've got to cut out.
Yeah, okay, very good. Thank you, Doug. We're having lunch here in the room. There's some cold cuts. If you haven't already found, the restrooms are out. Go to the right and then another right and the right against the wall over here. And let me pray for our lunch here. Heavenly Father, we just thank you for Dr. Doug and just his words of wisdom for us this morning. Just pray for the couples here this morning and their relationships. I just think of that very first point of the being positive, that aspect of our relationship, of our demeanor that we have, that just we can have a positive demeanor with each other and just share our wishes, hopes, and dreams, and just have a relationship that would be pleasing to each other and, more importantly, pleasing to you, Heavenly Father, and just pray for our lunchtime together. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Yeah, just as